Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to start the second session. Please take your seat. Good morning once again, and welcome to the second session of today's conference entitled A Resilient, Complex and Dynamic Digital Ecosystem, 5G Security and the Internet of Secure Things. This session will look into securing the EU digital ecosystem and discuss key security initiatives in that context, such as the upcoming EU Cyber Resilience Act, the 5G Security Toolbox, certification under the EU Cybersecurity Act, as well as the recently adopted Delegated Act to the Radio Equipment Directive. I'm Visiola Pula, Senior Analyst at Calvin International, and I will be your moderator for today. The session today starts with a keynote presentation from Alejandro Cainthos, member of the Cabinet of Executive Vice President Vestager. Due to other commitments, unfortunately, Alejandro will not be able to stay with us for the whole duration of the event. However, he will be more than glad to take one or two questions right after his presentation. I'm also joined today by Dr. Andreas Mitrakas, online though. Good morning, Andreas, Head of Unit for Market Certification and Standardization at ENISA. Katia Kmet-Vrtsko, Head of the Supervision Department for Operators at ACOS and Co-Chair of BEREC 5G Cybersecurity Working Group. Alex Leadbeater, as well joining us online, Chief of the ETSI Technical Committee on Cybersecurity. Dennis Coogler, Head of Brand Standardization, Certification Policy and Supervision at the Federal Office for Information Security, BSI Germany. And Miguel Ángel Recio, Associate Director of Intelligent Product and Platform Security Lead at Accenture. Once each of the speakers has presented their messages, we will then go ahead with a panel discussion where you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. As this is a hybrid event, we will be taking questions from the audience present here, as well as through this tablet from the audience following us online. I think we're ready to start, and I would like to invite to the floor our keynote speaker for today. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and also for the flexibility in accommodating. These are, I think, difficult days for all of us, and don't always manage our own schedules as we would wish to. The conference you are organizing today is as important as it is timely. Russia's heinous invasion of Ukraine is a stark reminder of the importance of the work we collectively do on enhancing Europe's security. In addition to the tragic war being fought on the ground, the war is also being fought online. Disinformation, propaganda, but also digital tools as a means to rally morale and support. Cyber warfare has been part of Russia's invasion, although one could say that surprisingly not at the level we most feared. This does not mean that the worst might not still come. This is why the Commission has set up an internal cyber response task force to keep a watchful eye and is working very closely with the member states and in support of Ukraine. The good news is that the EU is in a better place than we may have been only a few years ago to face such threats. Still, there is some way to go. The cybersecurity strategy we adopted in December of 2020 is the most ambitious and comprehensive yet, and is being implemented block by block. It has allowed us to move beyond all taboos towards coordinated action and common purpose. One example of a taboo falling, as you have mentioned, is the 5G Security Toolbox that was adopted by the EU. This was a first-of-a-kind instrument for our Union. It was based on a joint assessment of risks throughout the supply chain, leading to coordinated action by member states, while respecting the national security nature of decisions and the different legacies in the networks of the member states. For the Commission, the toolbox is the model for how the EU should tackle ICT supply chain security. We hope that the revised NIS directive that should be agreed within the French presidency of the Council will codify this way of working together going forward. We are now knees-deep in its implementation. The Commission is in close contact with member states to ensure a thorough and robust rollout of the toolbox. And while we see different speed and scope of decisions taken, which also reflects the flexibility I was mentioning, it is clear that there is a common sense of direction and that member states are learning from each other. We are also adapting to developments within the 5G ecosystem, always with security top of mind. For example, the NIS Cooperation Group will soon publish its assessment on the security of Open RAN, and ENISA is working on a candidate certification scheme for 5G. The security of the backbone of our networks is important, but we also need to ensure that the many devices that will populate such networks are themselves secure. We know that the Internet of Things market in the EU is expected to grow about 12.5% annually for the next 5 years. It therefore goes without saying that ensuring that the security of connected objects will be paramount importance for the internal market. This is the main aim of the Cyber Resilience Act, which President von der Leyen announced in her State of the Union speech last September. The Act will seek to close some of the gaps we have by now identified within the EU acquis. The voluntary nature of certification is not sufficient for the challenge at hand. Existing product safety and sectoral legislation is not geared towards cybersecurity requirements from the outset, and stopgap measures, such as the new rules under the Radio Equipment Directive, will help, but they do not cover the whole spectrum of products nor their whole life cycle. Studies to date show that that pre-market verification is insufficient reassurance in an age where constant software updates and additional embedded and ancillary service are a common feature of connected devices. A horizontal approach is therefore justified. The public consultation was launched earlier this month, and we encourage wide participation of all stakeholders. We hope all of you will participate, and a thorough impact assessment will follow. As part of this work, we will also need to reflect on dual-use aspects. If there is something we have learned is that civil and military technology increasingly overlap. It would be a mistake for the defense dimension of product regulation to be an afterthought. Therefore, we must think about dual-use specificities from the outset. Our current ambitious aim is to present the proposal by the end of September. Let me conclude by emphasizing that in all these endeavors, the EU is not alone. Network and product security are important areas of cooperation with our like-minded partners, as evidenced by the symmetry going on in town today that has blocked us some in traffic this morning. And we will tackle this specifically in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which will meet in May in France. In the more contested world we will be living in for the foreseeable future, investing in cybersecurity is investing in the resilience of our economies and societies. The EU is taking important steps, more pragmatic, more united than ever. Squabbles over prerogatives and competence seem to have been a privilege of better times. Now we need to act with determination, trust in each other, and to put security first. Thank you for inviting me and for your attention.
Thank you, Alejandro. Before I open the floor to questions, I would personally like, in fact, to ask you a question, Alejandro. In January this year, the European Court of Auditors published a special report on 5G and 5G security as well. And in fact, there are some recommendations there. One of them, for example, if some aspects of the toolbox or some measures related to 5G security should be made mandatory, just as an example. Does the Commission plan to take any further action when it comes to the 5G toolbox or 5G security, of course, apart from the certification scheme that it's in the pipeline?
Yes, absolutely. So I think as part of the process leading up to the report, the Commission engaged intensely and in detail with the European Court of Auditors. This is an institution we very much respect and do very useful work keeping us on our toes and making sure that what we do stands up to scrutiny. So the outcome, as part of the outcome of that discussion, we prepared an action plan to implement the recommendations in the report. And I think it's fair to say the vast majority of them will be implemented in the course of this year. That goes both for the deployment part on 5G, and there we have, in addition to the electronic communications code, we have we're now working with the member states in what we call the Digital Decade Policy Program. through which member states will take commitments in order to take us to our 2030 digitalization goals. And we hope that this program will have a very robust section on deployment, because we are lagging behind, unfortunately, the timelines we would have wished to see. And on the security side, of course, we are looking at all the recommendations, and this is being done through the NIS Cooperation Group, the same group which drew up the toolbox itself. And each of the different recommendations will have a different timeline, but as I said, I cannot speculate on the outcome yet, but I think all of them will be tackled within this year.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor for Alejandro? Yes, please state who you are and also your affiliation. Thank you.
Octavian Popescu, I'm a consultant at EUCOMREG. The question I have is related to the certification schemes that will be coming compulsory. And can you tell us if there is an envisioned network of authorities or something like notified bodies to actually implement this type of certifications?
So under the Cybersecurity Act, which was adopted, I believe right at the end of the last mandate, ENISA now has the power to draw up EU-wide certification schemes. However, these schemes are voluntary by nature. This is why, depending on the area, this might be sufficient, but we think in some areas it might not be sufficient, and that's why we think, in particular, when it comes to horizontal product regulation, a mandatory approach might be justified, and this is the thinking underpinning the Cyber Resilience Act, which I mentioned a moment ago. In terms of the certification that is ongoing, we have a cloud certification scheme that ENISA has been working on for some time, and it's now hopefully mature very soon. And we have a 5G cybersecurity scheme, but at this stage I cannot talk about its outcomes. It's only in the making. But as I said, these are voluntary by nature.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. We will be taking one last question from the floor in case there is any other pending question from Alejandro. Well, Alejandro, then thank you very much, and I will leave you to your other commitments.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We will move now to our second speaker for today, Dr. Andreas Mitrakas. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Great. Many thanks, Viziola. Many thanks for the invitation and for accepting me as a speaker from at a distance. It was impossible to join this week in Brussels. A great audience you have managed to put together. I just wanted to echo what has already been mentioned in the opening of the conference, that cyber security is shaping alongside the building of the house analogy. And as Vice President Skinas suggested, we're looking into different rooms, so different chambers that are connected in multiple ways. And under this light, as also our director, Johan Lepassard, suggested, ENISA is playing its role within its competencies framework, seeking to underpin different activities. Cybersecurity certification is but one of them, and I'm here to talk about it. But still, ENISA is also looking into helping, assisting member states and the stakeholders to get a synthetic view on cybersecurity, as we increasingly more realize what a sprawling issue and impactful issue it is for not just for the digital single market, but for the whole extent of the competence of the European Union. Now, on the background, of course, we can talk about the Cybersecurity Act, which reaffirmed and slightly extended the mandate of the agency, and it also introduced the cybersecurity certification framework. The framework itself is voluntary, and it seems to me that its strengths lie on its voluntary nature and on its ambition to make trust measurable by means of the security requirements that transparently and objectively pieced together on the schemes, on the cybersecurity schemes. But the overall objective is trust. Now, the pandemic led us to realize how broad cybersecurity, the electronic services are in the digital single market, and how much we depend on cybersecurity, because layers of the population that did not quite have much of experience in electronic services, all of a sudden they were asked to live their lives online. And the war, actually, this last month, awful month, in this war situation, has underlined the urgency about bringing cybersecurity further into fore and making sure that we leave no loose ends. Currently, we have 3 schemes at different degrees of completion in NISA. We have a scheme concerning common criteria that is quite mature. We have a scheme which is going to be formally finalized, because for all practical purposes it has been finalized in the next few days. And we have and that's the cloud scheme. And we have the 5G scheme that was launched just 4 brief months ago, and it's moving on plan, so we will have news for you later in the year. And the 5G scheme, of course, builds on the experience and on the requirements laid out on the toolbox. Now, I think a key point here is to remember that cybersecurity concerns the digital single market, and NISA is an internal market agency. But the complexity of the digital single market is not about electronic transactions as we've experienced it for the better part of the last 25 years, but it means much more. Therefore, cybersecurity all of a sudden means much more for public authorities, for the citizen, for the place of the EU in the world. And under this light, public authorities need to be further empowered in order to exercise their duties, but also to forcefully and effectively protect the interests of the member states and of the European Union. If we had a better experience, perhaps, with fake news, our very effective response could have been slightly anticipated, and perhaps the situation with this the case of Cambridge Analytica would have been so awfully impactful in Europe. My message is that we should not be naive about what things mean in this day and age, and we are confronted indeed with a more challenging environment, even at our narrow cybersecurity certification context. And sometimes we have to respond to policy requirements, and fewer times to political requirements. But rest assured that we have the ability to weave these requirements into our technical documents and into our schemes. We have the inputs of the stakeholders, the support of the experts, and importantly, we work with the member states and with the Commission in order to make that happen for you. And we look forward to the requirements of likely mandatory certification under NISD 2 and the proposal of the Cyber Resilience Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. I will just keep you 1 minute longer. In fact, what about the certification on IoT? It was a topic of discussion last year. Is there any plan or work going on that within ENISA?
ENISA works on cybersecurity certification schemes on the basis of two types of prompts. The first one comes from the Union Rolling Work Program. The second one is based on requests that they take two forms again, but they always are sent by the Commission. The point is that currently NISA works along the lines of the three schemes I just mentioned. So only preparatory work or analytical type of work or recommendations type of work that NISA has been known for the last 17 years can be submitted to the audience. So under this light, NISA has proposed and works very closely with the European standards organizations, with Sense, Senelec, and ETSI. And we also have Alex on our panel representing TC Cyber in ETSI. We know of the accomplishments in terms of a European standard in 303645 that refers to consumer IT. So one could imagine that along the lines of this consumer IT direction and the industrial IoT direction, we can plan our work in the future. We already have such preparatory tasks on our planning, but I cannot come forward with anything more concrete than this. So a small promise for something more concrete later this year. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this with us. We move now to our third speaker for today, Katja. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Viziola. So my name is Katja Kmet-Vrčko. I come from Slovenia, Slovenian Regulatory Authority, and I'm also co-chairing the PEREC 5G Cybersecurity Working Group for the last 3 years. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this really interesting and timely conference, of course. And due to all the distinguished speakers we have here among us today, I will really stick to my thoughts and experiences as a regulator of the electronic communication market, and a little bit as a co-chair of the 5G Cybersecurity Working Group within BEREC. I have my colleague, co-chair team here with me, so just in case somebody wants to speak with him as well. So when I received the invitation to this conference, there was no sign about this uncertain situation we are facing so far. So I'm afraid I cannot simply ignore the latest developments. So Ukraine-related crisis changed also our regulators' lives, a little bit daily routines for sure, some more than others. For example, our Polish colleagues are facing huge problems due to increase in traffic in their borders areas. Then colleagues from Baltics are reporting more cybersecurity incidents. All NRAs are facilitating and in consistent implementation of Council regulation concerning restrictive measures in view of Russia action in Ukraine. And we all cooperate closely with ENISA, which allows us to regularly dispatch relevant cybersecurity news to the national operators. In addition, most of us nationally, we meet a lot more also with our operators. And in such meetings, all sorts of stuff pops up. I don't know, Viola, what do you think that electronic communication and oil have in common?
Considering how sectors work today, for sure there is interdependency.
There is, yeah. But it is not because operators transfer IP packets with some fast cars, of course. That's not a fact. Electronic communication networks don't work without electricity, of course. And when there is a power outage, operators need a backup for run their networks. And for aggregates up and running, of course, they need fuel. And until very recently, it was like something normal. It was business like usual. It was also part of a national legislation in some member states. But almost over the night, the risk of fuel low stock appeared, and due to European dependency on the fuel providers, the situation is like it is. So with this, I would like to maybe move a little bit into the history. When we regulators entered this cybersecurity fast train, that's how I call it, and vendor dependency was raised on the European level, but for very different occasion and very different reasons. It was actually 3 years ago with the European Commission recommendation from March 26, 2019, of course, because it was discovered that within the EU, for good functioning of the internal market, we do need a good common tool to synchronize all member states' approach towards cybersecurity in 5G networks. What happened in a really short time, member states needed to do this national risk assessment. At least for me, I mean for us, nationally, it was quite a challenging task, I must say. But due to a very good relation with our market players, it didn't turn out too bad. So at least to me, it became quite obvious that the inputs of different member states to what was later then included in the European risk assessment will be quite different. Within BEREC, we were also tasked to do this really interesting survey at the time on the state of play about security requirements in 3G, 4G, 5G networks. We reached out also to the operators. We received around 70 responses and their views and information on the security measure and plans for the 5G networks. And BEREC then provided this survey as an input to the EU toolbox for 5G security, which was then adopted by NIS Cooperation Group and the Commission and published in January 2020, which we all remember and was already mentioned. And this is how the famous year 2020 actually started, with no corona there. And it ended up with the lockdowns, virtual events, we all remember, travel restrictions, and the famous cybersecurity package from European Commission, December 16, I remember well. To make the long story short, since then, member states are implementing ECC USA, so Electronic Communication Code still. We are introducing the appropriate national legislation for strategic and technical measures of the EU toolbox. And at the same time, NIS2 directive proposal is here, with a big ambition to be adopted this year already. And it intends to transfer the articles concerning network security and incident handling from the ECC under the NIS framework. Last year, BEREC also expressed its concern on these consequences of this change and published its opinion just a few months after this cybersecurity package was published. Just some last thoughts, maybe. I promised 5 minutes. For this fast train to be moving, it's great that ENISA and the member states and the NIS Cooperation Group, the Commission and BEREC have discovered the opportunities and the need to strengthen the level of cooperation which is really needed to address the present and upcoming cybersecurity challenges properly. With this, I will finish my introductory part. I'm looking forward also to the next session with the discussion.
Thank you, Katja. Alex, you're next in line. The floor is yours.
Yes, good morning all. So just trying to find the unmute button, and in fact, good afternoon for those in Brussels. The time's just ticked over, hasn't it? So yes, I'm Alex Lebiter, work for British Telecom Security, albeit the global services arm. So the bit that doesn't deal with the UK. But talking very much today about ETSI, ESOs, so European Standards Organisations, and the sort of the 5G landscape. The first thing I want to observe, I guess, in anything we do be it in certification, in standards, or in fact anything we do within the European context, is to measure the purpose of what we're considering. Cybersecurity is a cost. It generally, as my own colleagues find, whatever I say to them in terms of I want you to implement a security mechanism, that's going to have an impact on products and services. Now that's a good way, but it does have both a benefit and a cost. So what we need to consider in everything we do with the Cyber Resilience Act, with CSA, with RED, is does it deliver the end benefit to the European citizen, and look at everything with that lens. So that said, I think as other speakers have said, we live in interesting times. 5G is going to greatly increase the connectivity of every user with multiple devices, be that devices that are designed for 5G in that fully digital connected world, or indeed a lot of legacy devices. And I think people very often forget about those, that will also become much more connected than they were designed for. What I think we should also dwell on is that 5G security, and I spend a lot of time in 3GPP, the organization responsible for the core network security design, both in Europe and globally, is developed on a secure by design ethos. So security is built into the fundamentals of 5G in a way that wasn't for 3G and 4G, and also privacy by design. So 5G, in terms of what it exposes the users to, what it encrypts by default, is much better than the legacy technologies. So I think while the risk landscape and obviously the number of threat actors, others have talked about the interesting attacks that have all of a sudden miraculously occurred on European networks that were occurring 4 weeks earlier. Now we can't think why that happened, can we? Those sorts of effects, yes, the landscape has increased, but 5G is fundamentally more secure than that went before it. So we at least have a good starting place in that cybersecurity certification journey. But we do also have to remember, and I think Katja made a very good point when she spoke about actually 2G, 3G, 4G. We're not just talking about securing 5G, 5G connected technology. For example, if you want to send a text message or a voice call on 5G, that's actually a 4G technology underneath, predominantly IMS, that does that. So we will also have to consider how that legacy meshes in, and while some of the older technology does have some weaknesses, we also need to remember in terms of what the industry has succeeded in doing over the last 25 years in the mobile space. While 2G security isn't great these days, it's actually stood up pretty well. So again, there is a reasonable confidence from an industry perspective that we will be able to certify 5G, we will be able to harden it and develop the trust that the European community, or the European Commission and the European citizen expects from it. We also, though, need to remember that 5G is not just about those cell antennas we see on the street. 5G is more than that. It brings in fixed 5G, it brings in Wi-Fi, it brings in what they call the NTNs, the non-traditional networks, in other words, satellite, marine. And we also have to consider how will they fit into the critical national infrastructure wrap that the European member states wish to secure. There are clearly some strong points around security already. The GSMA NISAS scheme that ENISA is looking at for development of the 5G certification scheme goes a long way to providing some of those building blocks. Yes, it doesn't cover everything, but it's a very good start. Similarly, as Andreas talked about, EN 303645, the consumer baseline IoT security requirements. If we can persuade all manufacturers to implement at least the top 3 of those in 2022 or 2023, it's worth noting that all of the major IoT security incidents that have occurred, be that DDoS attacks or other poor security on child dolls and other items, would not have occurred. So those basic 3 provisions, no default passwords, having a coordinated vulnerability disclosure scheme, and also having a means of keeping your products updated Had all manufacturers and all of civil society come together to achieve those aims, they're really, really basic within that EN, none of those IT incidents would have occurred. So very much, we do have some tools in place. What I also find interesting when people talk about these tools being optional, yes, that is true to a degree, but if we look at this with a GDPR lens, it's a brave manufacturer or a brave service operator that would ignore some of these optional schemes completely, because GDPR requires best practice security to protect the European citizens' privacy. So if you've opted not to do something and then you get a privacy breach, you're not going to be in a particularly good place with the member states and the regulators. So yes, they are optional, but my view to people is always ignore them at your peril, and they will probably become mandatory anyway. So a few other things to sort of think about in the opening sort of comments. The other so trust is transitive. Trust is not absolute. People, I think, want to try and acquire legal certainty, and the Radio Equipment Directive (RED) pushes for this. But we have to accept cybersecurity is an instantaneous thing. Your view of trust varies from day to day, and indeed, one member state's view of trust of something will vary to another. So we have to get used to evolving trust and accepting that it is not absolute. Now, that's legally difficult within the Commission frameworks, but that's something we have to accept. The other thing we also have to accept in a European context is a good, around about 70% of 5G IPR and the things we want to protect in the supply chain are not European. So we have to accept that 5G is a global technology. It is fully interconnected. And therefore, while we want to strive for strong European security regulation, we cannot do it in isolation, nor can we have a European sort of internet that doesn't quite work with everybody else's. So we have to sort of balance that strong cybersecurity European leadership, and frankly, Europe is well ahead of the rest in this space. But we also have to remember that one size does not fit all. What we can do with our enterprise customers is not the same as for SMEs. So we do have to think about how do we make it achievable for the smaller backbone of the economy within the European Union, the SMEs, and help them to also be cyber secure in 5G and otherwise. So I think that's probably enough from me as an opening thought, but really exciting time. And obviously standards underpin a lot of this, along with the ENISA's certification schemes.
Thank you, Alex, for your messages. We will move now to the other speaker for today, Dennis Coogler. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the opportunity of being here. It's really important to have a physical conference, to exchange ideas, to talk to each other. I spent the last 2 days talking to so many people that my voice starts to fade away, but I will continue and again talk about the Cyber Resilience Act, which is, we heard it today a couple of times, it is one of the most important regulations that we will probably hopefully have by end of this year. So, but the question, which to my opinion was not answered, why is it so important? And that is the topic I would like to try to answer in my presentation here. When I prepared myself for the panel, I asked myself, how can I explain what's the Cyber Resilience Act about? And I came up with a comic on XKCD. XKCD explains things, easy. And this comic was about how digital infrastructure is built nowadays. And it was visualized as a building of bricks. We had the analogous to cybersecurity and building already this morning, but this is exactly the opposite. So the building was built out of bricks like kids do that. Yeah, you have one piece here, one piece there, you put another platform on top of that, a pillar here, and you go up. Yeah, this is how our digital infrastructure is built. You have so many components in it coming from various places, unknown places, and of various features you're not even aware of, security vulnerabilities, of course, and so on. And in this comic, the lower brick on the bottom right It was labeled, this component is maintained by a single person since 2003. What immediately came to my mind, it was not meant in that way, but what came to my mind, this is log4j. A software piece of component which is in so many products with a feature in it which could be misused and led finally to really some powerful attacks. And yeah, if you draw that out, the whole building falls together. So that is the problem that we face today. And it really, unfortunately, I have to admit, at least in my experience, all the digital infrastructure that we have today is built like in that comic. It could be 5G infrastructure, it could be IoT devices, it could be standard software. This is the way how we build our digital infrastructure. And we have to fix that. And this is exactly what, at least I hope, the CRL will solve by putting some rules for the development of software, for the vendors to follow simple rules, horizontal rules applying to all the infrastructure that we have, at least in the connected case. Probably not for your calculator. So how do we solve that problem? And I also like the analog of food safety. For food safety, you know you have to declare the ingredients. Yeah, it's by law, you have to declare what's in that product. You have to list substances that might be allergic or you might be allergic to. Yeah, you have lots of information to put on the product itself. Compare that to our digital infrastructure. What do you see on a digital product? Nothing. This is what we have to fix. We have to make transparent what's in a product, what risks are associated with a product. It does not necessarily solve all the risks that are in, but at least it gives you a chance to identify risks and to take some appropriate actions against those risks. So the Cyber Resilience Act is sort of a glue that we require for putting all the other legislations that we already have, like the NLF for the CE marking, like the CSA, Cybersecurity Act for certification schemes, and the NIS directives into one thing that fits together. This glue is missing in there. And the glue is basically, as I said, first about transparency. Transparency is implemented usually, for example, with security by design. I don't expect that we will get away from those buildings with those bigs. So security by design, we could hope for that, but it's unlikely to come. So the only chance that we have is certification. Sort of a certification. So when I talked about certification like a year ago, certification for me was always common criteria certification, EL4 plus, higher tech potential. I can tell you lots of things about certification at that level, but the products that we are facing, if we consider all digital products on the European market, EL4 plus is certainly not the way to go. I mean, that's obvious. So we need certification at lower levels. We need certification at an adequate layer, so products that have a high risk, that are used in critical infrastructures, for example, and where you can stay with certification times of let's say 1 year. It's okay to require for those products a certification level high, EL4 plus common criteria, for example. But for the vast majority of products that we have on the market out there, this is certainly not an option. It's simply not possible. So what we need is certification schemes that are simpler. And the Cybersecurity Act also allows certifications at the level basics, the lowest level, to be implemented as self-assessment. So the vendor themselves declares that he has followed all the rules. For example, security by design, but yeah, unlikely, as I said. So simple rules could be, for example, as I said, the list of ingredients. Yeah, we have that already known in some other areas, came originally from the US. Software bill of materials. Just declare on your product what's in it. What libraries do you use? How are they configured? Yeah, what external cloud services do you use that you might react allergic to potentially? getting back to the analog to food safety. So that's it. Yeah, simple rules in form of a self-declaration. That's all I personally require for the CRI for the vast majority of services. Should be doable for most vendors to do that, and it's also good practice, in my opinion, to do that, to be able to tell others what's in your product. So that should be simple. On the other hand, if we say certification, we go for a very simple approach. What we need is a strong market surveillance that is able to take care that the risks that are still in the product, because you don't have a certification at level high. You have products that are affected by vulnerabilities. And with a list of ingredients, you can identify risks quickly. For example, Log4j, from the beginning, it was known that this library has a vulnerability, but we didn't know where that vulnerability shows up. We didn't know which products were affected by Log4j. Nobody knew. And I still believe that today are thousands of products out there with an unfixed Log4j problem. So market surveillance, if all products are required to list, at least to national authorities, what's in their software, we could automatically figure out which products are affected. Not always in all cases, and there are certainly lots of ways to get around declaring which parts you have in there, copied from some other parts. But at least for the majority of problems that we face today, having this software bill of materials together with a database and automatic way for looking for vulnerabilities and a strong market surveillance that can enforce to fix those problems. Not just tell that there is a problem, as it is today with the Cybersecurity Act, for example. Market surveillance and the Cybersecurity Act works the way we can withdraw the certificate. That won't solve the problem out there, withdrawing the certificate. What we need to do is we have to enforce the vendor to fix the problem. And that is, in my opinion, what the Cyber Resilience Act is about.
Thank you, Alex, for your very clear messages. And our last speaker for today, Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Viziola. It's really a pleasure to be here today after some years without these meetings, and specifically for this session, 5G and IoT. Brief introduction of myself. I'm Miguel Recio from Accenture Industry X Security. I joined this company last December, so very, very recent, to grow the smart platforms and broad security. This is really new initiative that started a couple of years ago. And not only to provide security in IoT or industrial IoT, but as well to 5G private networks and dedicated networks. This maybe it's a different from 5G in general, but they are very much related with industry and specifically maybe with public safety. That is another industry sector we've been talking about today. Previously, I was working for Telefónica, Spanish telco, for 4 years in supporting the IoT security, not internally for the networks, but for the services that they provide as connected car, connected asset tracking, etc. And before working for Ericsson, a telco supplier, pioneering technologies like IoT, 3G. Okay, so I'm trying to bring my background here today. Okay, having this audience, I think it's of supporters, security supporters. I think that we can all agree that the situation today is critical, and in terms of protecting 5G infrastructure, because as we have heard before, this technology is supporting a lot of industries. But as well, it will support, but not today, consumers' digital life. Okay, when I remember, would say 15 years ago, there was a number in Ericsson that was 50 billion connected products. Today we are around 20 billions, okay? If this is not the engine of the digital economy in Europe, I don't see any other digital engine to move the economy forward. So it's really, really important to be aware of the population that I mentioned before, of all the threats that these devices will imply in our normal lives. Maybe you remember the war in Iraq some years ago with the Fitbit bracelet. Easy thing that nobody could think of those times that it could be a problem for the safety of the military forces there. If you remember, there was this application just provides you the opportunity to share your activity and your location easily and by the public. So they say the forces from Iraq detected some of the quarters of the soldiers because they were just running, maybe some footing in the morning. Okay, so it's something that I don't know if maybe today that they are publishing TikToks or whatever in the Ukrainian war. I don't know, but it's an interesting point. Okay, that still population is not conscious about this issue of security when we're talking about of IoT products. So having this type of certification, as Denise has said, if you put a stamp on the product in the very same way that you are providing this for safety, I think it will improve the awareness in the population. Okay, I don't know if self-assessment will work. Okay, 2 years ago, the Global Certification Forum just launched an initiative. I don't know if there was succeeded or not yet, but it's a good starting point. And having that from European Commission, I think it will be even better, internally in the European market, because it will allow to differentiate companies that will provide that stamp from the others. So it will start to move the economy in this way that you will select this product instead of the other one because you are worried about the security that is providing to you. Another topic that has been talked before is just the difference between the industry and the consumers, and how industries that we consider that they are very, very modern, that could be talking about autonomous cars, they are still using all methodologies when they're developing their products. You cannot imagine that, I wouldn't mention some companies, but they are still not introducing security by design in the processes. I've seen now in my current job that we are supporting these companies to introduce from the very beginning and during the whole life cycle of the product, pen testing activities, when they are launching and delivering services to the market, the ancillary applications, that is very, very relevant. Not only the devices, but the ancillary applications that are behind. And one of the other type of companies that we are seeing is that those that are as well very modern companies, startup companies, that the target for them is go to market far faster than the competition. Okay, so they are implementing some kind of security more in the application than in device sides. Okay, so having those type of certification focus in the devices side, it will help very much. But when we are going about go to market faster, they are forgetting about security, and this is a reality. They are going for price, because Alice talked about that, and what we think is that, and we have the data from our projects, that it's evident that at the end the cost of introducing cybersecurity countermeasures after design phases is around 20% and 60% more expensive to introduce in later stages of the manufacturing and testing production. So in that sense, we can't forget about that. But we can see security as an enabler of new businesses, because nobody in industry, for instance, could think that having the data of the business based on devices that are not trustable. How can you trust on data coming from devices that you don't trust on it? If all the business decisions will be made in the future provided by this type of devices, you must trust on the source of the data. So you must see security as a new enabler for businesses. Now, those data that are personally related or information with privacy, you can use for another businesses that maybe we cannot think about that today because they will be newer. But if you don't trust in this type of data, you cannot enable another businesses around that. So going for this type of certifications, I think that will support all that establishing this measure of security in products and the hardware, software, and applications and seamless applications about that. And what we see is that certification takes a long time to be established and to be delivered. We started with the European, the common criterion version, okay, and still waiting for that. But the hackers, they are not waiting for us to have the certification. They are like that.
That's true.
yeah, they are. But even if we have the latest certification scheme and maybe the best one, it has been said before, I think it was Thomas that in the previous session, that security is a status. No, sorry, it's not a status, it's a process. So certification will be a picture of a status in one point of time.
Exactly.
So we need to establish procedures that introduces security during the whole life of the cycle. What we from Accenture is proposing to our customers, supporting for this type of certification, is to have a product security program that covers from the very beginning to the whole life of the cycle. The certifications will come whenever it has to be done, but we need to protect with this type of programs the security of the products that we are launching. So, thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. I would like to thank once again all our distinguished speakers for today and their key messages. And we come to the funny part of the session today. So I would like to open the floor for questions. I already have some questions from the online audience, but if there is any burning question from the audience here.
We do understand you're hungry.
We have a very nice lunch break after this, so hang on for a little tight. Okay, Dennis, I have a question for you, in fact, from the audience. Are cybersecurity ratings an effective instrument to strengthen the supply chain security of IoT? And can we expect this type of risk assessments to be included in the Cyber Resilience Act?
How do you rate cybersecurity?
Are cybersecurity ratings? So,
Ratings.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I understand the question correctly.
Shall I repeat it?
No. It's more content-wise.
Okay.
Cybersecurity ratings. I mean, we have the risk assessment is rather difficult. Yeah? You have the Cybersecurity Act allows certification schemes to be at different levels. You have basic, substantial, and high. I think it is relatively clear what the intention behind that is. But how do you really assess the risk that a product has, not the product itself, but the product in the current application? Yeah, you can have very different requirements, for example, for a router. Let's say for a router. Yeah, a router that you use at home, a router that you use in office, a router that you use in an industrial context. Yeah, it's still it can be the same product. What is the risk associated with their product? At home, probably it's no risk, not much at least. It might be a bigger risk in some other areas. So how do you really make sure that you have the risk assessment done correctly? And that is why I just said what we need is market surveillance. Risks have to be identified and then have to mitigate it somehow. Yeah, and depending on the circumstances, how you use a product, you have to have different mitigation products independent of a potential certification. That's important in my opinion. I'm not sure that that really answers what was meant in the question, but that would be the answer I can give.
Anyone else would like to comment?
Miguel? It's difficult to measure, but something that must be done is just not taking, let's say, the checklist as well, but take it some evidence. So for the newcomer resilient, I think that it would be a good idea to take the evidence when you make the risk assessment, because sometimes, and we see related, for instance, with the supply chain requirements that we pose and during the procurement of this type of devices or applications. It's a big list, more than 40,000 requirements that when you go for an RFP, what you would like just to check, yes, whatever. But we will need evidence. In the situation that we are in, we will need evidence. Maybe for not of all the requirements, but for critical, for instance, for critical industries, I think that we would support that the risk assessment must be supported with evidence. You have this, okay, please provide evidence for that, depending on the level of the criticality.
But the important thing is that the risk assessment has to be done by the organization that uses the product. It's not necessarily the task of the vendor of the product to do the risk assessment for your use case. Yeah, you can only say a product provides a certain level of transparency, security. Yeah, in the case of a basic level, certainly it's not checked thoroughly, the product. That must be sure. But you can say, I tolerate that risk because in my setting, I'm fine with that. You can use the same product in a setting where it's probably not really tolerable, but you have additional measures taken for the product. It's basic. Yeah, I think that is some things you have conflicting requirements often. You have the requirement, of course, I would like to have a bulletproof product that is really secure in all cases. But on the other hand, we want to have products to be updatable, like a new release, new features in there, and potentially even fixes to security problems in the product. And then we would like to deploy the product immediately. But still, if you require a more or less heavy certification on the product, you would not be able to release that quickly. So in that case, you have to say, okay, I know the product should be certified at a higher level, but it's not possible in that case. I have to go for a rather basic certification and do some additional measures. I think that is one of the effects that we especially see in infrastructures like 5G. Yeah, that is certainly not all components in a 5G network are certifiable to the level high. It does not exist. Yeah, you have to make sure that despite the fact that you are certifying to a lower level, you have additional measures to mitigate the remaining risk.
To complete the picture. Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. Andreas, Alex, would you like to jump in and maybe comment on this?
Perhaps in this day and age, you cannot expect to have a fairly faring business unless you carry out your risk assessment. So I would start from that point onwards. Then again, risk assessments were mandated in the security policy frameworks that were standardized very early in the process. I mean, some people might remember BS 7799. So what I'm trying to say is that looking from that prism, it follows what Dennis suggested, that you can set off on the basis of self-assessments that look into particular weaknesses in the context of specific threats that a product or a service might face. in quality, they say that if you gold plate everything, it doesn't mean that you have better quality if you didn't gold plate everything. So the same pretty much applies on cybersecurity. You have to know what what we have to tweak, what we have to harden. It doesn't mean that if we harden everything, then we have a functional and a purposeful system. In our situation, when we look into the cybersecurity certification schemes, and thank you for several references made to ENISA, we take firstly risk-based approach. So for 5G, we have compartmentized the analytical parts of our work along the lines of NISA's, of the GSMA, UICC requirements or specifications rather. But we have inserted a phase where we take a look at 5G as a system and from a process standpoint, and we apply a specific homegrown methodology in order to determine assurance levels. And we also apply the concept of complementarity across schemes. So when we started out with common criteria, in the back of our heads, we knew that there was another scheme coming along, and you'll see by reading the two proposed candidate schemes, one parallel to the other, that there are components that run in parallel indeed. And the same will also happen with 5G, because when it comes down to accreditation requirements, very important if you're a member state, to conformity assessment bodies, equally important for member states, but also important for the private sector stakeholders. You do not need to reinvent each time that you have to face a new type of testing. I also believe in disclosures, and we have on the CSA a requirement on ENISA to publish certificates and declaration of conformity. But we're also looking into producing a suitable label as a brand, as a market recognition element for the consumer. And the consumer is an economic actor in a broad sense, and also likely nutrition labels in an effort to make slightly more visible, not as ambitious as transparent, but slightly more visible what the tested product is all about.
Thank you, Andreas. Alex, would you like to comment, and Katya as well, on the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think taking it back to the question, it's worth saying, and for those of us on the panel, I mean, we can ask ourselves, how many times when you last walked into an electronics store, did you pick up the back of a box, turn it round, look at it, and go, "Oh, that's a a wonderful cybersecurity label that's on the rear of it," or this has got 256-bit encryption versus 128. You just don't do it. You look at the front of the box and go, "That looked really great on Instagram." So I think that's the first thing we've got to get over is labeling for the consumers is great, but a bit like the traffic light labeling, and I think the food analogy that Dennis used is great. The consumers have kind of got behind the fact that red's probably a bad color for any food constituent. Green is slightly better. So if we can try and develop through ENISA some form of labeling, we'll get a long way. But we also need to, I think, separate that 5G in terms of its infrastructure is always going to be probably critical national infrastructure. Find me a member state that doesn't have 5G or 4G as a critical part of all of its services, its power and everything else. So we're not going to have basic level 5G networks, at least not commercial ones. That said, the consumer IT devices, for example, running those through common criteria is madness, because what we're actually talking about is devices in people's houses that nation state attackers do not attack. So yes, they will do nasty things to them for botnets, or for example, if they identify a smart thermostat in a residential property, for example, that belongs to a diplomat or somebody within the European Union with status, or a industrial conglomerate or similar, yes, they might have a go at that house. But generically for the European citizen, nation states do not attack your thermostat. So we somehow have to come up with a way that leverages both those devices, and as the Radio Equipment Directive says, this is all about expected or intended use. So we have to balance that off. Obviously, industrial equipment is going to have to be higher certified, but we also do have to accept that some of that consumer equipment has a nasty habit of making its way into critical national infrastructure. And there have been numerous cases where equipment that really was not intended for industrial use suddenly becomes part of your critical national infrastructure. So it's not quite as cut and dried as will allow self-assessment, but clearly there's going to have to be an element of that. But for me, the biggest takeaway from this is coordinated vulnerability disclosure in terms of how we share and improve those products, but also information sharing within the Cyber Resilience Act framework that allows us to share that information between member states. Given that 5G will largely be built and a lot of these devices on open source software, i.e. everything is going to have the same vulnerability as we found for Log4j, the ability to disseminate and share, which has not historically been great in this sort of space, is going to be a key to that sort of agile security improvement as well. And that then links back to the certification as well that Denise is leading.
Thank you, Alex. Katja, would you like to comment anything
Yeah, I mean, we
from the
are.
regulator point
Yeah,
of view?
it's a bit different than what we
Yeah, I
had today, but
understand.
yeah, it's a good starting point anyway. I mean, we cannot simply avoid the costs. And we are noticing that, or we figure that cybersecurity will cause some extra cost also to our market players. And that's why I think that we will need to focus a lot in the future also to areas like what's going on with the competition on the market due to other developments. They go all hand in hand. But you know what, we have been fighting for 20 years now, you know, to establish this competition on the markets. You know, we all have now many operators nationally, so we have the ability to choose. So, I'm not sure if we'll be able to keep it, or we will need to have some really smart regulation. So, for everybody, for the whole community, industry, policymakers, ENISA, other certification bodies. I hope that we will all be here really smart and come up with the appropriate solutions for everybody. On the other hand, of course, we would be happy to give consumers and users a good advice on secure products. So this is also the other area where usually NRAs are quite active. So we look forward also to these labels. And of course, we will need to follow the work closely. So yeah, it's like we said already, it's a process.
Thank you, Katja.
I may add one more thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
On vulnerability disclosure and information sharing. I think what's important is to point out is that we already have the infrastructure in place. The Cybersecurity Act already has the European Cybersecurity Certification Group, which is under ENISA and is exactly the place where the national authorities meet regularly and exchange information, also including information concerning vulnerabilities and coordinate themselves. So what's really important is not to invent the wheel again, not to introduce other groups, but to make use of what we already have in place. Yeah? To make really sure that there's one central point where you discuss vulnerabilities and cybersecurity, and that is already in the CSA.
Thank you, Dennis. And in fact, I will pick up from there when you talk about disclosing vulnerabilities. And I wonder if for these manufacturers of IoT devices, should there be maybe an obligation, in fact, to report vulnerabilities similar to the obligation under the NIS2 for the sectors falling under the NIS2? Should we impose such an obligation on these manufacturers as well?
I would expect that this is a general a requirement for a vendor to tell you if your product is insecure.
No, it's
Yeah, no,
Yeah, but what happened now is that they are not prepared. They don't
of
have
course.
any organization internally. For instance, the PSIRT, Product Security Incident Response Team. They are not. They are not.
Vulnerability should also be simply handled by the certification scheme, which is already part also, again, Cybersecurity Act tells you the certification scheme has to have vulnerability handling. So it has to be part of the scheme to do that. And depending on the scheme that is used for certifying the product, the rules of the certification scheme, even though it might be self-assessment, still it should be kind of a certification scheme, including vulnerability management, patch management, and what else belongs in that area.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel would like to comment?
I was just going to observe on the
Yeah.
on the CVD one that it's interesting. The latest statistics for that is about 20% of manufacturers producing or offering products on the European market have a CVD scheme. 80% do not. It's not a great statistic. If you look back about 4 years ago, it was 8%. So in terms of improvement, it's significantly better. But we still have a very long journey to come with that one. Obviously, CSA, yes, in theory, will force some of that through. But currently, the uptake is very, very low. And largely that's because the SMEs, as the sort of engine of European economy, just don't have the expertise to do that. So there's some good shoots of growth in here, but we still have a long way to go in that space.
Thank you, Alex. We will move, I think, to our last question for today, in fact, because we are reaching and we're a bit over time. So, yeah. And it's, in fact, addressed to Dennis and, Miguel from Oscar Lopez Torres, CTO 5G Mobile Telecom. Thank you for explaining your approach to certification with manufacturers. A question regarding 4G and 5G, where the radio access controllers are often exposed to open, non-secure locations. How does your organization ensure that software code and its needed data is properly authorized? In other words, that important code is securely downloaded and its integrity is assured. Looks complex. We'll pass it to you, Andres. Yeah, we are getting quite technical.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are big and complex procedures when you are deploying 5G or 4G or even 3G software in networks. 5G also provides you the technology and let's say the network, the possibility to have everything, let's say, encrypted and cipher and all the procedures. What we are working with the telco operator is just not to tell them that the standard provides security by design, but to working with them to really implement, to configure everything. But when they start to operate the network, it's do it in a secure manner, because the complexity of 5G network is totally different story about all the technologies, 4G and 5G. Now we are talking about virtualization, software-defined networks, orchestration. We are working about even having the core network deployed in public cloud providers. So what we are doing is assuring that all the procedures, when they start to implement, and for sure when they are updating and upgrading, everything is covered in terms of security. Okay.
Thank you, Angel. Anyone else from the audience, from the panel, would like to comment? No. Well, I think I would like to thank you for your yeah, for today, to my panelists, to the audience as well, thank you very much. And we will proceed to lunch, in fact. So I have here that we will come back at 13:45. There is a lunch just outside, and during the lunch break, there will be also some exhibition booths from Cloudflare, ESCSO, and Sectra. And for those attending virtually, you can now use the networking function, in fact, to connect with the other delegates and visit sponsor booths in the expo area. And after the break, we will have a high-level discussion looking ahead, cybersecurity and future technologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating.